Enjoy a seat at the table and good company, where great conversations and meaningful discussions happen.
Welcome to And Good Company. I'm Sarah Fiedelholtz. We all know a great dinner party isn't really about the food. It's about the people seated around the table engaging in lively discussions. And Good Company creates a way to capture smart and important conversations as they happen. I am pleased to again, third time's a charm, to be in the company of Zach Benedict, the principal of MKM Architecture and Design. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So yes, so you are officially the first guest to be back for a third conversation, which seems because I never can run out of things to talk to you about.
We'll see.
So I really like to tap into your passion for the well-designed places and this whole emphasis of human connectivity and how we improve personal well-being and we reshape spaces. But I also like how you overlay it with what I call your urban sociology, and how you really pull from lots of other subjects and areas to really integrate and think about when you do your work as an architect and designer. So today I really, and usually I don't have a topic for these, I usually let them go, but our topic I really want to talk to you about is libraries.
Okay.
And you even said that you had I think it was a Facebook post where you said you will tell anybody who will listen about the importance of libraries and how they are one of the last democratic spaces that create a unique civic facility and they have the responsibility to engage the community. So they really tap into your whole belief of this connecting spaces and people. And subsequently, I think that also demonstrates because your firm is currently working on 3 library projects.
Yeah.
You've got the Wells County, the Lawrenceburg Public Library, and the new
Carlisle, Elkhart, LaPorte, Hartford City, Wabash.
Oh, so there's more.
Lots more.
Oh, wow. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I didn't realize.
Yeah.
So you're really becoming the library expert in creating the spaces.
We're trying to help where we can.
Okay, so let's first talk about, before we talk about the actual projects, I want to talk a little bit about the philosophy and the role that a library plays within a community.
Okay.
And what do you see is the importance of a library, especially in its past, present, and future?
I think a public library has always functioned in some way as an opportunity incubator. In some capacity, that's changed over the years on what that entails. But I think they've always had that niche identity within a community. The thing that makes public libraries so interesting to us is the fact that the majority of them, north of 80%, are in rural communities. Mm-hmm. And there's more libraries in this country than there are McDonald's.
Well, there's 16,500 libraries throughout the U.S., all in big cities, suburbs, and rural areas. So, but what's interesting is also, though, 80% of the funding for libraries is local.
Correct.
State and federal funding covers less than 10%.
Correct.
So then that also creates an issue for libraries.
It does, but it also gives them some sense of a sustainable revenue stream. You can argue it's not enough, but it's at least theoretically sustainable.
And but how do you think that the role of the library today, and thinking about it for creating the library for the 21st century, and then understanding its past, because that's also what you do, is look at that. How has that framed how you think about libraries and how you approach these projects?
You commonly will hear libraries classified as a third place. So there's this theory that all communities excel with the triangulation of 3 places. First place is home, second place is work, and then third place is like the Cheers song where everybody knows your name. Right? And libraries have embraced that role. What probably isn't said as often, though, is how important that role is to the vibrancy of a community or a local economy. And maybe even more important than that is what an operator of a third place has to do for that place to thrive. I'm probably not as interested in libraries as I am librarians, as you know, just a unique person in any community, and probably one of the last people that over the given course of a day deals with the full spectrum of the community. They, within 15 minutes can deal with a homeless person and a CEO and not know which one's which. There's not a lot of institutions left in our communities that haven't vet out some ends of the bell curve.
Right.
What happens on the sidewalk happens at a circulation desk in the library. It is an extension of the community. And their staff now bears the responsibility of having to not only understand that, but react and serve it in a way. It's the last place you can go without the expectation of buying something.
Right.
So it does have, I think, a heightened responsibility to understand and engage the community. And it has, I think, in that way, kind of a Spider-Man complex. With great power comes great responsibility, and in a rural community especially, they play an interesting role that wears multiple hats. They're the community center, senior center, visitors bureau, town hall, you name it.
Right. Place for moms with toddlers to learn to read.
Supervised visits for parents, the full spectrum.
Right.
And their staff now has become really kind of this hyper cross-trained professional that, I can tell you where a book is, but that's not my full job description by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay, but I want to pause for a second, because you talked about this idea of these third places, which is in part how you design the landing, in a sense, that the apartments and that there's the third space. But we also now have this issue in this triangle of a third place is work. So work may not necessarily, because of the pandemic and where people are working now, is shifting, and maybe a lot of people are not going to be going back to a place of work.
Yep.
So do you think that is going to change this triangular, and then do you think that also then may change the role of the library, because maybe it will become more like a WeWork center?
And it was before COVID. I think it will increase once the kind of the smoke clears in the pandemic. The easy way to think about it is in places: first place, second place, third place. It's probably a more nuanced way to look at how we'll look at it is those places also have realms that have a responsibility. So home is a realm of privacy, work is a realm of purpose, paid or volunteer, and then those third places is a realm of fellowship. You can get those in different ways, that you can blur the lines in between them. What research will indicate is your attachment to a neighborhood or a community is really reliant on your interaction with those three realms within an everyday routine. So when we think about, say, a thought exercise like not going back into work ever again and maybe working from home, I think that's an interesting psychological experiment to say, how can I still carve out a realm of purpose and privacy under the same roof? Because the second they blur together, I'm going to start to get confused which is which.
Right.
And that's when stressors get induced, loneliness increases. So there is, I think there's going to be a glorification of the home office, right? Because you need to define where that realm starts and stops, so you can turn that switch on and off.
Right. Like I've been working at home for 18 years. So even when I moved to a one-bedroom apartment, I made the bedroom the office, and then I live like in a studio, so that I can close the door and shut it off.
Correct. And you need that.
You need that space.
You need that.
And you need a very good chair.
Right.
I had to go. That was the one thing, I had to buy a new chair. So, but do you think that? So let's go back though. So the role that the library will play in this engagement and connection for the community. And it's also, though, described as like a community barometer of the vibrancy
very much so.
But the problem also is because so much of the funding is local, there is a lot of disparity between different libraries, because based on the funding, right?
Yeah.
So they're not all being able to serve as as these places for community connection and resources.
There's very varying levels of operational budgets.
Right. But if we go back, though, also to the history of the library, right, and the whole purpose of it, it was really to ensure that this idea of social mobility, and that information is not a privilege, but a right, and the idea that it housed knowledge. So, I mean, that hasn't changed, right?
In theory, no. What I think the future of the public library is going to have to reconcile with is a culture of fact-checking. When you say you're the beacon of knowledge, you also assume that you're the beacon of accuracy. And that's going to be, I think, a growing concern, because I think that reputation and role is extremely important, but it's going to be increasingly challenged when it's under the veil of knowledge. For instance, over 70% of all internet searches by patrons in libraries are health-related. People are going to the library to look up symptoms, insurance, whatever it is.
Right.
By and large, by individuals that don't probably understand how to get accurate information online.
Right.
But I think there's some security or perception of security that I'm finding this information at the library.
Well, that's the perception that
Yeah.
there is, absolutely with libraries, in the American Library Study, that it is considered trustworthy,
Yep.
honest, and reliable information, even if you're on a computer in the library, but it's the fact that you're in
Correct.
the library. So, I mean, and also because when you go online, it is, in some ways, it's a very solitary, you sit down in front of the computer and you go online. So in thinking about this idea of, and the role of the librarian, so when you're thinking about how you create libraries, do you think about putting the computers that people do research on more in like a cluster? I mean, there was the issue during the pandemic that for people who needed to do group studying
Yeah.
on computers, that we had to separate out. But do you think that going forward, that you need to have that resource of the librarian, like not just send somebody off to the computer, but
Yeah, I mean, when you talk to librarians, they'll really talk about how they want their staff to be close to computer users for tech support, but also
Right.
questions and interaction. When you're planning a library, especially in a rural setting, what you'll find is you don't have an unlimited amount of square footage. They just don't. So what you end up doing is trying to think through the usage of the building throughout the day, because the user group changes dramatically
Right.
from opening to close, and how you can cross-utilize some of that space. So the crowd that comes in the morning is not the crowd that shows up after school, and the two paths maybe never cross, but you don't have enough square footage to give them all their own home.
right.
So it becomes this chronological, intergenerational facility that you have to kind of tool how it's used throughout the day, at the same time trying to nudge some behavior to encourage interaction and access, because that's really what they're about.
Right. So I'm just curious. So when I was thinking about if I was designing a library, two things I would really think about. One, the number of outlets that are available and
Yeah.
where they are.
It's like an
having
airport.
like charging stations. And then also having more like long tables, not just seating areas, because if you're going to work on your laptop or something, you want to put it down. So I'm curious if there are certain things like that that you think about when, and besides how it's going to be used. But I'm talking about really pragmatic. I mean,
Yeah.
that
No,
now
it's-
you really have to think about where you put the outlets. I mean, if you go out to the library, we're in the library now, you couldn't find an outlet.
Yeah.
So how does that, in the overall, like how is that kind of thing changed?
Yeah, the power needs are like an airport, right? I mean, you can't say you have a teen space without 87 locations
Right.
to plug in phones. But I usually try to think about them more in terms of zoning for noise, sound. The last thing I think you want is to perpetuate the myth that librarians' job is to shush people,
Right.
right? But it is an issue, because that is in some way how some people use the library. They come there to study and they need quiet and privacy. But it's also now evolved into this third place that's vibrant and active and engaging. So you tend to think about this when you're planning a new library, at least from scratch, is how can you zone this in a way that we can understand that we're in a vibrant place, but I can come there and do the function I want, and acoustically I don't have a lot of crossover.
Well, isn't that a lot like how you create the atriums, and those have a lot of light, and then you sort of create, or are you creating like spaces that sort of, I always envision everything where all the fake walls are on tracks, so you could move them, it's like a big puzzle, and you could move them to create different spaces, or based on what you need, not a fixed room space.
Yeah, being nimble and flexible, I think, is critical. and librarians, I think, over the years have deserved the reputation of really reacting quickly to. No industry, I think, reacted faster to the pandemic than librarians did.
Right. And we also saw the need for library because of the fact that we don't have parity for digital access.
Right.
And we really saw that and that role that they play for that. And then when they were closed, that really was a detriment for a lot of students.
Yeah, and they were fighting desperately to get back open because they knew that people relied on them.
Right.
And that to me is the biggest issue, is the accessibility, both, you know, from a disability standpoint, but also just cognitive. It feels accessible, feels open and inclusive.
Right, and you don't want to be afraid to ask the librarian questions. It's ironic because it is a place of knowledge, but in some ways you go there because you don't know something.
Correct.
So it's, you know, it is sort of that mixed kind of idea of it.
It has two personalities. One is enlightenment and knowledge, and the other is protected ignorance.
Right, right.
You need that platform to have some open discussions, or go to a lecture by someone that you might not agree with. You know, that's, in some communities, that's the last bastion of that.
Right.
And that is a real need. It's a real role that I think they play.
And how do you think, because you're really, a lot of libraries you're doing are rural libraries. So tell me, what's the difference between the needs and how you create a rural library versus what we would find more in a city or a suburb?
I think, you know, especially in a metropolitan setting, a larger library has the ability to narrow its focus and refine really its purpose. It can function as what I think most people would think of as a conventional library. Because
people can find the other services that they need easily?
The community likely has other amenities that play those roles.
Right.
Where in a rural setting, which is the vast majority of all libraries, they can be the only game in town. It's where every single function happens. It's the only building in the municipality with the name of this town on it. Like, it is the building within a community. And it has this wonderfully forgivable brand, which is my favorite part about library. You can almost do anything under the brand of the library and get away with it. And that's a really powerful tool.
Well, because, I mean, again, according to the stats, so 8 in 10 Americans believe public libraries help them find reliable information, and 65% of Americans believe public libraries help them grow.
Right.
So it is a very warm and fuzzy, you know.
But I mean, so there's a library in Philadelphia that took some underutilized square footage and put a clinic in.
Okay.
And they were giving all the precautionary services from the local hospital there, flu shots, whatever. Right. And it exponentially increased people's usage of the preventative services. Right. Because it was under the brand of the library.
Because it still is this public, that's why I'm a big proponent, like Access Fort Wayne, this is in the public library. I think that having those services, but I think even in this library, the downtown branch of the Allen County Library, like, I think there should be a social worker or somebody who's here to help the homeless with services. Because one day, the library was celebrating, this was last year, it's the anniversary, and they were giving out cookies to celebrate. And this one little boy, the librarian was telling me the story, came up and, you know, took a bunch of cookies. Yeah. And it was really because he was hungry. Yeah. And she saw this, yet she didn't know, she couldn't necessarily do anything with it. So if we had even a food pantry or one of those community pantries now that people are putting places, or have services, so they have someone who could, you know, immediately come out and talk to the mother, or even have a little lunch bag or something to give this poor child. I mean, I think that, like you said, they are, in some ways, they are those first responders. But I don't know if we're giving them those tools on a city level or even anywhere.
No, and that, you know, that's why I'll frequently say, I'll talk to whoever will listen. We spend a lot of time talking to government officials and community leaders on a library's behalf on how important the library is. Right. I mean, they're the most effective public health official you have in a rural setting, because they're all dealing with the upstream realities of chronic disease and underserved populations. The healthcare system deals with it downstream when there's a chance to react to it. But if you want to really be proactive and sustainable about solving some of these problems, they're the greatest tool you have.
Well, that's all I did. We don't have a preventative healthcare system. We have a response to
Correct.
the healthcare system.
Yeah, healthcare by definition is reactive.
Right. But do you think also there was a time, really at the early part of the 21st century, where people really thought that libraries were going to become obsolete because of technology, and we didn't need this depository for physical books per se?
Correct.
Although I disagree with that too, because
Yeah.
I think that there is a throwback, and I like to read books because you can't annotate, you can't go back, and they are finding that more college students actually want the book. So, so I think a lot of people are surprised that in some ways libraries have become more important in the 21st century, not necessarily because of their access to books, but because of the need for all these other services.
Yeah, you always get the criticism that they're a warehouse of books and that's obsolete. And, I don't see that going away anytime soon,
Mm-hmm.
but I also think it helps refine this brand of accuracy and knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And it sets the stage of what that place is about, regardless of how much that collection is moving.
Mm-hmm.
You know, having a lecture in a room surrounded in books is different than having it in a room surrounded by other things.
Right.
The other thing is that the primary mover in a lot of cases for those smaller libraries is children's programming.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really, in some ways, how they're designed around.
Right. That's in the early 20th century when libraries were really starting to form, and it was actually women after the suffragette
Mm-hmm.
movement that really, they started the first mobile books,
Right.
and they really pushed the importance of public education and libraries. And so libraries that were created in the 20th century, it really was, everything was sort of surrounded by this children's programming and era. So that's still critical, though.
Correct.
That doesn't change, right?
No. When you're thinking about a library from scratch, when you're designing one,
Uh-huh.
I think the biggest challenge is, in a modern context, is trying to design a space that reacts to the needs of the existing patrons, but also trying to make decisions that allow you to engage people that don't have the library as part of their everyday routine. And that's much more difficult. They're hard to find, they're hard to engage, they're hard to ask what they want. But projects like ours tend to be a really good time to have that discussion and use it as a way to shift the culture and the brand of a library, whether it's real or superficial,
Okay.
to engage broader audiences and help the community relearn what a library is or could be.
Right.
And that's an interesting part of our work is, I doodle buildings for a living and then I leave. Like when we're done with a project, the stewards of the success of that place are the people that work in that building.
Mm-hmm.
So we just have to give them a platform to do their job as well as possible and don't let the building get in the way.
Okay, but also, but in some ways I think this idea of, in the rural setting, how you said there's mainly this one branch of the library and it's probably located downtown. But in your belief and practice of building the vitality of healthy neighborhoods, you also talk about the importance of branches, right?
Correct.
So is there a contradiction between what you're doing, like in the rural setting that has this one main area that people have to come to, or is it when you're talking about building these neighborhoods with these branches?
Two ways to look at it. One is you can talk about primary versus branch, or you can talk about everything at a neighborhood scale. You can have a town in Indiana that has 8,000 people and the entire city limits are within what the American Planning Association would define as walking distance, right? So the scale is a little different now. I don't know a lot of Hoosiers that would walk that far, but still considered walking. So the real question is, what's the extent and ownership by the community of those libraries? One of the key litmus tests on whether or not a third place is successful is if people use possessive language. My library, my school, my park.
Right.
Or the other neighborhood's park, the other neighborhood's library. And that becomes a really critical thing to consider when you're looking at this. So when it's just a single branch on a downtown Main Street, you have some challenges, and I think you're going to see more of this. I think you're going to see what COVID did show a lot of libraries is the power of their collection in terms of kits and programming that they could do outside the walls of the library.
Right.
They started getting really innovative in how they could package some of their kits and activities so people could check them out. I think you're going to see a lot more of that. I even can see a scenario where the branch location might just be a programming space that you can access or order kits and pick them up there. So they're closer in proximity to a
Right.
neighborhood,
Right.
but they're not a collection of books there.
So it sort of be like how Amazon puts like lockers in
Correct.
grocery stores. We could have library lockers because they have, I mean, they have a lot of kits now for children, like these play
Yes.
creative kits, even here in the library, where it has everything you need to have that creative, and they even have it for gardening and all kinds of things.
The difference is you can't have any size of a third place without a person. It's never going to function as a third place if it's an Amazon checkout locker. You can access services and goods, but it will not be a third place, and that'll be the difference.
Because you need that connection.
Physical and emotional connection to an operator.
And so the idea is does that also mean that cities and towns have to reevaluate how they measure the success of a library versus the number of books that are checked out versus usage or flow pattern or?
Yes. American Library Association has a calculator on it where it can help librarians calculate how much value all their free services provide the community. And it's millions upon millions upon millions of dollars, even in the smallest setting, that they're giving access to the community at no cost to the patron. They're not even calculating within that these complicated things like preventative care, which they're doing on a daily basis. I think one of the most underappreciated assets any community could have is a public library, and there's not many that have a good way of really putting a number to what their value
Right.
is. It's immense, though. It's immense.
And then also, I mean, there is this whole idea of co-location.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about a little bit about that, because Chicago has really done this very interesting with these 3 new housing developments, where they really put these co-location libraries,
Mm-hmm.
and they really made them very street-facing
Yep.
and very obvious to the community. So tell me about that approach, and what is co-location thinking in urban planning?
It's really trying to. Librarians are my favorite human species in the world. The one thing that they have a hard time doing is thinking what they're doing is retail. Right? They don't think of it that way. And I think the co-location concept is really trying to understand the power of the brand and the effect of third places, but more from a retail methodology. So it's more of a coffee shop scale.
Mm-hmm.
And the argument is, if I could do 4 of those versus 1 main library, we'd not only serve more people, but interact with more people,
Okay.
which is the key here.
Right.
At the same time, you're diversifying what a mixed-use development looks like with something like a civic brand like a library,
Mm-hmm.
which is different than big box retail or
Right.
another brand. And that really changes the trajectory and I think flavor of a neighborhood, is that we have mixed-use development in our neighborhood, but not only that, but the retail space is a library.
Right. So when we think about these retail spaces
Mm-hmm.
in these mixed-use buildings, we've got to rethink what we define as retail.
Yes.
Because also, if you think about it, if I was a developer, the best tenant to have is a post office.
Right.
Because so to think that having these maybe smaller branches or different branches of libraries. So in the idea of in Chicago, when they created them within these housing developments, did they take more of the approach of what the library does in a rural setting for that neighborhood and those residents? Or do you think that did they take more of the traditional, knowing that librarians are sort of first responders, yet
Right.
not necessarily having these services?
I don't know. It'd be interesting to see how they do staff training and onboarding different in those locations than they would in the others. And to me, that is always the difference. Architecturally, I think in some ways my role is insignificant.
I don't think you're insignificant because, well, no, think about it. When you sometimes go into a space, you know if it's well designed or if it's designed in a way, like a lot of times I think, it's the same, I think a lot of times the people who create things, they don't think about how someone is going to interact and use it.
I can help.
Okay,
I am necessary but not sufficient.
okay, well, all right.
And the reason I say that is the perfectly designed library can be an utter failure with the wrong staff.
Right. But that's true with anything, though.
Well,
right?
but I have seen amazing staff turn a horrible building into a wonderful place.
Because they can bring it to life.
So they trump me.
Okay. So do you think, though, there used to be a time when libraries were really cookie cutter.
Yeah.
I mean, they all sort of looked the same, and it was
too.
all, and then you really, they're really, like all of these that Chicago did in other cities, they're really bespoke architecture. They're really designed to fit in with
I'm torn. Carnegie imposed an aesthetic on all the projects he helped support. And it causes all kinds of ADA issues and problems today, but it does have, I think, a civic quality to that. That in some ways is different and contradictory to this discussion of third places. And
How so?
well, a coffee shop feels like a more accessible place than an ivory tower sitting up on a platform covered in limestone.
Okay.
That you're
the perception of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it also then, that Carnegie model has the perception of stability, authority, accuracy, knowledge.
Right.
We got to figure out, and I don't have the answer, we have to figure out a way to blend those two.
Okay.
I think part of the issue, and maybe one of the most critical decisions, is site selection.
Mm-hmm.
You could pick the wrong site, and you can't design your way out of that. You can't reconcile a bad site selection and create a third place.
Mm-hmm.
It's impossible.
Mm-hmm. Because it requires certain things, right?
Correct.
So in this triangle, does it have to be within a certain mile distance of the home and work? Because most people will not travel, they will not go beyond, it's 3 miles.
Right.
From where it's like you draw a circle from where they work or where they live. So like if they're gonna go to the gym or they're gonna go, everything they do, and just getting people to just go beyond that is such a hard thing.
Correct.
So is there some criteria for site selection when you think about creating a library or something that serves as a third place?
You're right on the 3 mile, but I think also the physical context is going to change that experience. So yeah, it could be a mile from my house, but if it's surrounded in asphalt off a highway, that's a different library than one that's a mile away but in my neighborhood, right next to residential homes.
Right,
That's
because people still
different.
want to believe that they can send their kid on their bike to go to the library.
Well, and the beautiful thing about in rural settings is they can.
Right.
And libraries play that role. When school's out, they get inundated with children with no parental supervision.
Right. Well, they also do the reading programs. They also do subsidized meals for a lot of those kids during the summer. They serve as the sort of the camp director in a sense for a lot.
And put that on the list of undefined value for libraries. Kids that maneuver through neighborhoods without parental supervision tend to do better on SATs.
Right. But they also do better on understanding of geography.
Everything.
Right. So do you think that also, when you talked about that you can't be, you're sufficient, but you can't do it alone, and when you talk to librarians and their role, so do you think that, and we've talked about this a little bit before, the idea of the role of an architect has changed and what you need to think about when you are creating these spaces? I mean, typically everybody thinks, some CEO or somebody decides, I want a building, and so they want it what they think it should be, and sort of you create that, and or there is the idea when we had the whole time of the Starchitects, where it was really more about saying that this building was built by so and so, and not necessarily the practicality of it, and limiting the definition of what an architecture is in terms of the space, the structure. And so do you think that today more architecture requires what you, as this urban sociologist, like you have to think about psychology and behavior and the needs and what types of people that are required to work there? And do you think that you have to, that's really important now in the role of an architect?
I do. I don't know if the profession would answer that the same way. I think the role of architecture as an architect has changed within the community, in the sense that we're trying to solve different problems. I pride myself on saying that architecture is really just a profession that loves glorified story problems.
Right. So explain what you mean by that.
Good architects are the ones that like complicated, there's 2 trains leaving, going at 100 miles per hour and 60 miles per hour. They're carrying
Rate times time equals
yeah,
distance.
right.
Math.
Yeah.
That's all math.
And what color was shirt was
Right,
Sally wearing?
right, right.
It doesn't quite make sense. There's too many variables to put a hard science to it, but you're trying to make the best decision you can with the information provided. The difference is, I think, traditionally in the Frank Lloyd Wright model, the problem he was solving was giving you a Frank Lloyd Wright building.
Right.
That was what you asked for. That's what you got.
Which is actually, it's Mies van der Rohe buildings in Chicago.
Yeah.
If you actually, there's the 3, that you can
yeah.
live. Those are actually very small apartments. Yeah. They don't have good closet space. They have very low ceilings. I mean, they're not necessarily what people would want to live in.
Right. But that wasn't the problem.
Right.
The problem was, get me a Mies building.
Right.
And you got one.
Right.
So problem solved. Here is different. And I think the role of an architect is try to make sure you're asking the right question before you solve it. And I don't know if that's changed, but I think the question and the problem has gotten more complicated, especially in the work we do, because we work in healthcare settings, public libraries, senior living.
Right.
To me, those are very complicated problems to solve that rely on your ability to dive down the rabbit hole of the intersection between place and people.
Right.
So when we're talking about a library, I'm asking, well, what problems are we trying to solve? Well, we want to serve the community. What does the community look like?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it looks like this.
And you also, but again, you also have to think about what is that community going to look like in 10 or 15
Correct.
years? Because like right now, we are in the midst of a significant demographic shift.
Yep.
Not only that, but now we've got all these shifts and things are happening, especially like you talk about that you do healthcare and senior living facilities, how that after the pandemic, I mean, I'm convinced nobody is going to be going to a senior living facility or a nursing home. Anyone who is in their 40s and 50s and 60s now will not go because they will remember this day and, and they'll be like, I remember what happened, I'm not going. So, I mean, you have to be able to take in all these, it's the demographics, the psychology, the sociology, I think that all these things play in making a building successful. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like you have to have it's sort of like the IDEO company model where you pull in lots of people with lots of different expertise and then you sort of look at the problem or tell the story of the problem. So do you, when you, like if they come to you and say they want a library, right? So what's your thought process? How do you start that? I mean, I guess it also depends if it was a remodel or a new library, right?
Yeah. You go through the tangible things of, do you have a building? Do you need a building? Do we have a budget? Don't we? Those kind of things. Right. And those, I think, are outputs. It's like me saying, I'll give you a building that's on time, under budget, roof won't leak, won't fall down, that kind of thing. That's different than saying, well, what's the outcome?
Right.
What do we want to be able to do tomorrow that we can't do now?
Right.
And that becomes a pretty complicated discussion around the trajectory of the community. Mm-hmm. Not only where it sits today, but where is it headed, and what role do we want to play?
Right. In the next, what? How 25 to
20 usually.
Years.
Usually, especially a rural community, they won't go after a bonded project within the 19-year period. You need to essentially, you get one project per generation.
Okay.
Think about it that way. Because,
in rural settings.
Yeah, because we're not going to vote for another tax increase for a bond on a school. We just did that.
Right.
You need a new group of people that haven't done that yet.
Right. Okay.
So you do have kind of this 20-year window, which works well with assets like roofs, mechanical equipment. Like 20 years is what you're thinking, but a lot happens in 20 years. And what we're doing today, we know we're not going to be doing in 20 years. The real question is, how can the community change this building? And mm-hmm. libraries are unique in that. I can guarantee you that the community will change them. Mm-hmm. How can the community feel empowered to change what's going on here, and how can the building itself as an asset mm-hmm. empower them to do that with some legitimacy?
Right.
And that, to me, is the question. So during the design process, we also spend a lot of time trying to convey to the general public, like the role of a library.
Right. But in some ways, you said that there is this good, warm, fuzzy feelings for libraries. So that they have.
Fuzzy, good, warm, fuzzy, and confused. And that's why I think the brand's so powerful, is you can do almost anything, and people's response is, oh, I guess that's what we're doing in libraries now. I didn't know.
Right.
That's what we're doing now that nobody's reading books. There's no real perception of what the library should be doing now.
Right.
And some of the best librarians are taking that advantage of that and providing what the community needs under the veil of a library.
And when you think about the library and the actual building of the library, does the materials you use change? Or like now the idea is like they're putting vegetative roofs on libraries and having these atriums that have real growing gardens and things. I mean, or the physical materials that you're using, because there's been so many changes now with even building materials.
Yeah, this is not the answer you want.
I don't want my answer. I just want you. I want to you to answer.
I don't believe in prescriptive solutions to multivariate problems.
Okay.
But
that's the idea that you believe, just like we got out of that, not every library can look the same. It can't be the same foot plan. It can't be.
And if you've seen one library, you've seen one library.
Right.
My job is to try as best I can to give the community the building that would make them most successful.
Okay.
I do think there are some consistent sensitivities you have to have as a designer. I don't think you can lose sight that this is a civic democratic space.
Okay.
That changes material.
Right.
Even if it's just for durability's sake.
Okay.
Like this building's going to get a lot of use and abuse. You don't want it to look bad in 3 years. Like that, and that changes the material palette right out of the gate.
Okay.
Scale is an important issue. I don't want this building to look intimidating.
Right.
I want it to look open and vibrant. And I want, if people are using a meeting room space, I want the whole building to know it's being used. I don't want you to be able to bypass that, short circuit the system, walk into a building with 200 people in it and think you're by yourself. Like you want this thing to be buzzing and hopping. So there are some principles, philosophy, but as far as aesthetics that manipulates and nudges behavior, I think you have to be really sensitive to the specific community, and as much as you can, and this will change, but the team that's going to use the building as a tool. You have to hear them and respond to them. I mean, there's been cases where I thought, oh, this would be really fun to do. That won't help that staff. That staff needs a building like this. And we work on this as something that they can use. But you have to do it with at least some flexibility that 10 years from now, if that staff changes, I can help adjust this. But it's a reflection of the community and the staff.
So let's talk specifically about a project.
Okay.
So let's talk about the Wells County Public Library.
Okay.
And so that was really a reallocation and renovation of existing spaces.
Strictly
right?
renovation, yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about what you did there and the process. Or what you're doing, I guess.
No, we're done.
Okay.
It's open.
Now, do you go back and see, or like sit and watch to see like how someone uses it or how they?
I will, but not yet.
Not yet.
It's too new still.
Okay.
There's
So
a
tell
honeymoon phase.
Oh, okay. So tell me about, talking how you brought all this together, all these ideas and all this research and being an urban sociologist, and what did you do and what did you change for the Wells County and Library?
Well, that one's easy because they have an amazing staff. So
Okay.
they initially engaged us to do a feasibility study, which is kind of common. You go through and you do an assessment of the building and what all things have to get fixed, and then you know how much money you have left to do things that could change the culture of the space.
Okay.
So we did that, and it was largely focused on, we shifted some stuff around, moved genealogy from upstairs down, moved some stuff around. But what was more important is they have this big grand central space that was really, it had evolved into a distracting space. Color palette, someone on the autism spectrum would have a real hard time in the space, and I think that's important to consider. Because
you have to, if it's a public access, it's for everybody, all needs.
Yeah. And you had to walk through this space to get to children's and genealogy.
That's not right? A lot of people don't like that. Yeah.
And it was an acoustic nightmare, which was a problem for older adults with hearing aids.
Right. That's why they don't like restaurants, because restaurants have gotten louder. Yeah.
So it had a lot of real problems. Overarching issue, though, is it didn't feel like it had a center of gravity. There wasn't a space in it. It just was a rambling set of rooms that never had any sense of closure or containment or safety. It didn't feel comfortable. So what we did was little things, simple things. That project's really just a new circulation desk, a really fun ceiling, and an amphitheater. Like, that's the kit of parts. That's all you really get to play with. But how do those things connect to redefine what this space is? So we framed in the lobby, the central space, put this really warm wood, curvilinear, wavy ceiling in it.
Right.
That then tied to the second floor, opened up a series of space, turned a narrow stair into a big amphitheater.
Right. I was going to say it's like what Apple does in a lot of their
Yeah,
stores. They have this very large
similar scale.
staircase, but it's really used for people to sit and
Yeah.
engage or have activities.
And all that really did was it gave what Jane Jacobs would call multiplicity of choice in the heart of the building. So now I have a space that hopefully every day you come is being used differently. And your brain doesn't know how to process that. This is a room to do what? I don't know, because every time I'm here, it's being used in a different way. So this building feels like it's always changing, always doing something. And at the same time, the location we picked for that opened up my view aperture to the upper floor. So the building now feels bigger, I'm connected, but this new rolling ceiling had an acoustical mat below it, and we've hopefully solved a lot of the acoustical problems.
So is those examples of with the amphitheater and the sort of central, your idea of what is the social welcoming?
Yeah, I think what you want, it's like the reason movable seating in public parks is so successful because people like to sit in chairs that they decide where they sit.
Right.
And my favorite thing is to watch time-lapse photography of people in public parks, and they'll only move it 3 inches. But it's like, oh, now it's perfect. And then they sit in it. And they feel like they have some control over how this is positioned and where I sit. I think good civic space is that way, inside or out. So the nice thing about these larger amphitheater spaces and different seating arrangements is extroverts, introverts, they all can adjust these micro adjustments to the building to their liking. And the important part is across all ages and abilities. So a 5-year-old can walk into that lobby, adjust where they want to sit, move some cushions around, and him and his 2 best friends can have a conversation. And to me, that's really important. It doesn't hurt when you do a 40-foot mural of a bison. Like there's a big, huge piece of art in that lobby that was tied to some community surveys. But you want, I think, this discussion of civic or not, stone or wood, all these kind of things, that's interesting. You want something that the community is proud to call theirs, and you want a space that a 5-year-old walks into and goes, wow, like that's, as an architect, that's kind of what you're shooting for. If you're anything else, you're overcomplicating it.
Okay.
Because I think when a 5-year-old does that, a 40-year-old is too. They just are embarrassed to make the noise.
Right.
It's not much different. We're not, we don't change that much.
Right.
And that's all that project was trying to embed a couple of really strategic decisions based on science of how we could help broaden the quality of service we could provide different individuals, at the same time giving it a refresh, renovation, aesthetic upcharge, but more importantly, providing them a space where people felt like they could engage on their own terms. And at the end of the day, I think that's the role of the library. Yeah.
So I have to shift a little bit and pivot because I would not be doing justice to this conversation if I did not ask you about why the film Big Fish is like your all-time favorite film, and it would probably be the film that you would watch if you had to be on a deserted island with only one film. It's probably the film you would take.
Sure.
So the story is really about a frustrated son who tries to distinguish the fact and fiction from his father's, while his father's dying his life. His father sort of tells these very elaborate tales about his life and experiences, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So now we are going to have to have a spoiler alert because a key thing is the ending of the film, but about what the son learns about, because he really was very aggravated and really felt, and there's this very key, and then I'm going to let you talk about it, but this very key, the issue of the film is clearly a father-son relationship, and you have 2 sons, and you just showed them this film.
Yep.
But the son really felt the difficulty of getting to know his father, and he said that he didn't see anything of himself in his father, and I don't think his father saw anything in him, yet we were like strangers who knew each other very well. So I am wondering, what is it about this film and why this film speaks to you, and what is, and I sort of get it because of, as you mentioned before, the importance of storytelling, and you're there to solve problems with stories. Okay, so this is one big tall tale of stories. Yeah. Okay, so now I understand that part. But why is it this film so resonates with you, and what is it about this story?
Well, first off, I think it's a beautiful film.
It's done by Tim Burton.
Yeah, it's a gorgeous film. But the main character, the father, and the whole movie is a series of flashbacks. And I think it's a wonderful story to use an example to talk about the romantic connection between mythology and fact. I think it's a beautiful way to depict life as what you make of it, and maybe as magical as you want it to be. And you know, the part where the son's frustrated with that is one dynamic to the story. The other is to see how someone remembers their entire biography through the lens of wonder. I mean,
right.
Everything about his life was
grandeur,
wonderful.
Splendor, right.
And you could argue not factual, or you could say, yeah, it is if you look at it through the lens I'm using. I look at it through the lens that I just married the most beautiful woman in the world. Is that a factual statement? Maybe not, but man, I feel that way. That's how I remember it.
And do you think it's really, the emphasis is the idea that we really are all just a culmination of our stories?
I think that's the only thing that is immortal. You know, I won't be around, but my sons will be telling stories about me.
Right.
That movie would make more sense if you met my dad.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and I wondered if there was a father-son relationship connection.
Not a frustrating one, but you know, he's been a good role model that.
Right. And clearly he fostered this relationship because you also are very close to your brother.
Oh yeah.
So
and it's a family favorite. It's kind of the Benedict men's favorite movie.
And what was it like showing it to because you just showed it to your sons a little while ago for
the
first time. And how old are they?
They're 10 and 12.
Okay.
They really liked it. You know, their father can't get through without crying. So, but no, they. I think they got it. We'll watch it again.
Do you tell stories? Are you a big storyteller?
Yeah. I'm probably a bigger. I have a tendency to see things as extraordinary things. I asked my wife to marry me a dozen times, from 13 to 21 until she said yes. Like I have a habit of romanticizing.
Well, you have a sense of wonder. And,
yeah.
And an unconsumable curiosity.
Yeah. I love ordinary things, and that's what I like about that movie.
I always say that extraordinary is just missing a space because it's really extraordinary. When we're all trying to be extraordinary, if we really all would just be extraordinary, we would be fine.
And that's why I like that movie, is it shows you how much you're missing by looking for these magical things when everything has
can be magical.
Yeah.
Right. So believe it or not, at the end of each Good Company show, I ask 12 questions. They're not the same 12 questions because you are now the only person on my third group of 12 questions. So believe it or not, I do have 12 more for you. So what do you most dislike about your appearance?
I got a big head.
But that keeps you bright.
Yeah.
Which living person do you most despise?
Oh my. I don't waste energy on that.
Good.
I don't know.
So you don't waste energy on thinking about.
No.
What is the quality you most like in a man?
Integrity.
What is the quality you most like in a woman?
Intelligence.
What or who is the greatest love of your life?
My wife.
When and where were you happiest?
When I took my sons to Universal Studios.
And wasn't that after you did a whole series of movies?
Yeah, we do this thing.
What was that series of movies you did?
Harry Potter.
Harry Potter, and then you took them as like the culmination of
and
it.
I thought I'd hate it. And it was.
Well, it's also because you were seeing it through their eyes.
It was magical.
So, right.
It was fantastic.
There's that sense of wonder.
Yeah, it was great.
If you could change one thing about yourself, what would it be?
I wouldn't procrastinate as much.
Which historical figure do you most identify with?
John Adams.
What is your most marked characteristic?
Marked.
Meaning something that people really point out or notice about you.
I have opinions.
Who are your heroes in real life?
Parents.
Who is your hero in fiction?
Writers.
So anyone who writes? Well, do you have a specific hero like Spider-Man or?
Oh shoot, what's his name? Not Gregory. Who's the dad in To Kill a Mockingbird?
Oh, the character by Gregory Peck.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I can't think of it. Yeah. So, okay, we know who he is though.
Yeah.
What is your motto?
It's all relative. It's better than being chopped up by a chainsaw.
Okay, is that your quote?
That's
or is
a family motto.
Okay.
We've used for
Is there a
years.
story behind how that?
We grew up pretty poor, and whenever you complain about something, that was my father's response. It's all relative. It's better than being chopped up by a chainsaw. So we still say it. My boys say it now, which is probably makes the Big Fish movie make more sense.
Right. Yeah. So now everybody's going to have to go and watch the Big Fish
hey,
movie.
if they can come to my house.
Right. Okay. So, and we already have you scheduled to come back for a fourth conversation
Okay.
because I never can run out of talking to you because obviously we never cover even half. And if we really did go to dinner, we would have to go somewhere where they would have like a 23-course meal, which I think we should do sometime. Okay. So you can learn more about And Good Company and all the other great conversations we have had at andgoodcompany.info. You can also see the other two parts of my conversations with Zach at andgoodcompany.info. We look forward to next week when we again invite you to enjoy a seat at the table for great conversation and good company.